The stepmother was an angel in front of my autistic son, but secretly, she mistreated him with a silent cruelty that no one saw. The father, a millionaire blinded by love, suspected nothing. The boy, unable to express himself, suffered in silence. Everything changed when a simple cleaning lady, an observant woman with a good heart, was hired. Then, one day, the father came home early from work, and, as he approached his son's room, he heard a sound that chilled his blood. The scene he saw next left him paralyzed with horror, revealing the true face of the woman he was sleeping with. Arthur Sterling surveyed the scene in his living room with a tightness in his chest he insisted on calling happiness. The golden late afternoon light streamed through the immense windows, illuminating the fine dust that danced in the air and coaxing glints from the crystal adorning the marble fireplace. His new wife, Veronica, was seated on the Persian rug, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, her voice a sweet whisper as she tried, with a patience Arthur considered angelic, to show a wooden toy soldier to his son, Leo. The boy, 7 years old with eyes that seemed to contain distant galaxies, did not react. His focus was on the intricate pattern of the rug, his small fingers tracing invisible lines only he could see. Arthur sighed, a heavy sound that was lost in the vastness of the room. He had built an empire, a fortune many would consider the pinnacle of success. His stock portfolio grew daily, and his investments in tech startups ensured a constant cash flow. He had enough capital to buy anything, yet the only thing he truly wanted was his son's attention. Ever since Laura, his first wife, had passed away 2 years ago, Leo had closed himself off, a small oyster of silence and pain. Veronica was the promise of a new beginning, beautiful, 20 years younger, with a smile that could melt glaciers. She had charmed him with her apparent dedication to Leo, promising to bring the boy back from his silent world. Arthur, blinded by loneliness and grief, believed every word. He saw the way she researched therapies, the state-of-the-art equipment she had imported from Germany, the way she spoke of Leo's progress with a sparkle in her eye. He saw what he needed to see, yet sometimes, in the quiet of the night, a memory of Laura would assault him. Her laugh, the way she would genuinely get down on the floor to play with Leo, the authentic sound of joy that filled the house. Veronica's joy seemed rehearsed, her gestures calculated. Arthur would brush away those thoughts like a bothersome fly. It was his pain talking, his guilt for not being able to protect his family from tragedy. Veronica was his second chance, his most important investment. She was the manager of that delicate asset that was his family's happiness. "Darling, you've been standing there for so long." Veronica's voice brought him back. She rose to her feet, smoothing down her silk dress. "I was thinking, this house is so large, and with all of Leo's therapies, I barely have time to supervise the cleaning. What do you think about hiring a housekeeper, someone discreet, just to help keep everything in order?" Arthur agreed readily. Anything that made Veronica's life easier, anything that left her with more energy for Leo, was a sound decision. To him, money wasn't a problem, it was the solution. If dollars could buy peace of mind, he would spend them without hesitation. The following week, the agency sent a candidate. Arthur was leaving for a meeting about a new cryptocurrency fund when the doorbell rang. Veronica answered, and Arthur, from the top of the grand staircase, saw the woman standing on the doorstep. She was a simple, almost faded figure. She wore modest clothes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she had a look that seemed to carry the weight of the world, but also a strange serenity. She didn't gaze at the wealth of the house with awe, nor at Veronica with subservience. Her eyes, for a brief instant, met Arthur's, then shifted to a vague point behind him, where Leo was standing, watching a sunbeam on the wall. The woman introduced herself in a low, steady voice. Her name was Sophia, and as she entered, She brought with her a stillness that contrasted with the noisy perfection Veronica tried to impose. A cold, unfamiliar breeze seemed to have entered the house warmed by money, and Arthur felt an inexplicable chill, a premonition that the carefully constructed order of his world was about to be shaken. Sophia quickly learned the geography of the Sterling mansion. It wasn't the rooms themselves that guided her, but the emotional currents that flowed through them. The library, with its scent of leather and old books, was Arthur's refuge, a place of silence and concentration where he managed his immense fortune and complex business dealings. Leo's room was a universe apart, a sanctuary of order and repetition where every toy had its precise place, even if rarely touched. The kitchen, with its stainless steel appliances that gleamed under the recessed lighting, was Veronica's stage, where she supervised the preparation of special meals that Sophia noted were more for show than for Leo's nourishment. The woman moved through the house with a quiet efficiency, her footsteps muffled by the expensive rugs, her purpose clear: to clean, to organize, to remain invisible. She polished the silver, vacuumed the carpets, and scrubbed the marble floors until they reflected the ceiling like a sheet of still water. But her eyes, observant and sharp, cleaned more than just the dust. They absorbed the inconsistencies, the small cracks in the family's facade of perfection. In that first week, she established her routine. Arthur left early after a quick breakfast during which he tried, with little success, to engage Leo in conversation. His phone calls were filled with terms like profitability, assets, and dividends, a language that seemed so distant from his son's silent one. "I have an important meeting about a new investment fund," he would tell Veronica, kissing her cheek. "Don't wait for me for lunch." The moment the heavy iron gate closed behind Arthur's car, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The sweetness on Veronica's face would dissipate like morning fog, replaced by a hard line around her mouth. Her voice, once like honey to Arthur's ears, would become metallic and impatient. "Come on, Leo, time for your therapy," she'd say, taking the boy by the arm with a firmness that bordered on roughness. Sophia watched from a distance, while dusting a bronze statue in the hallway. She saw the reluctance in Leo's body, the way his little feet seemed to stick to the floor. Veronica would lead him to the end of the hall, to a room she called the sensory therapy room. The door, always impeccably white, would close with a soft but final click. And then silence. A heavy, unnatural silence that seemed to press against the walls. Sophia continued her work, but her ears were on high alert. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, the echo of her own hardships. But the sight of Leo's toys, expensive and untouched on their shelves, bothered her. The German electric train set, the Danish building blocks, the collection of realistic plush animals, they all looked like stage props, not a child's treasures. On Thursday of that first week, while dusting the upstairs hallway, Sophia heard it. She froze. The cloth suspended in midair. The therapy room door was closed, as always, but from within a sound emerged. It wasn't laughter. It wasn't the sound of play. It was a muffled sound, a short, swallowed sob, followed by Veronica's voice, low and sibilant, each word a tiny knife. The exact words were unintelligible, but the contained rage within them was crystal clear. The sound cut through the silence of the house and lodged itself in Sophia's heart. A splinter of ice that refused to melt. The sound haunted Sophia. That brief, stifled burst of anguish, followed by Veronica's whispered venom, echoed in her mind as she scrubbed, polished, and swept. She tried to tell herself she had misunderstood, that the house's soundproofing was playing tricks on her ears. Maybe it was a TV show or a game that sounded strange from a distance. But her gut, a tool sharpened by a lifetime of silent observation, refused to be fooled. She began to watch more closely, not as an employee but as a guardian. Her eyes followed Veronica, noting how the woman's smile was like a switch, flipped on in Arthur's presence, flipped off in his absence. The patience Veronica displayed was a piece of clothing, carefully put on in the morning and shed as soon as her husband's car left the property. During meals, the charade was nearly perfect. Veronica would prepare Leo's plate with theatrical care, mashing organic vegetables and cutting fruit into star shapes. "Look, sweetie, I made this for you," she'd say, her voice like velvet. Leo, however, rarely ate. He would push the food around with his fork, creating patterns in the puree, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the plate, beyond the dining room, perhaps beyond existence itself. Sophia, pouring water, would see Veronica's jaw clench for a fraction of a second. She'd see the flash of irritation in her blue eyes before it was masked by a layer of feigned concern. "He's having a tough day," she would say to the room, to the walls, to Sophia, the invisible witness. "The therapy sometimes leaves him exhausted. The special food, expensive and nutritious, almost always ended up in the trash, a waste that pained Sophia, who knew the value of every grain of rice." The house was a paradox. There was so much wealth, a net worth Sophia couldn't even conceive, manifested in every piece of art, every designer furniture item. She would overhear Arthur on the phone in his office, talking about stock fluctuations, the profitability of a new gold investment, the need to diversify his capital. It was a world of numbers and profits, an ocean of money that somehow couldn't fill the screaming void in that house. The multi-millionaire's fortune seemed to create islands, isolating each person in their own reality. And on the loneliest island of all was Leo. On a Friday afternoon, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, glinting off the granite countertop Sophia had just wiped clean. Leo was sitting at the table with a glass of orange juice. Distracted by a bird that landed on the windowsill, he moved his arm abruptly, and the glass tipped over, spilling the sticky orange liquid across the floor. Veronica, who was reading a fashion magazine, let out an exasperated sigh. "For God's sake, Leo, can't you do anything right?" she hissed, her face transformed by rage. Before she could stop herself, she grabbed the boy by the arm to lift him from the chair. It was a swift, almost imperceptible motion. "Sophia, clean this up," she ordered, dragging Leo out of the kitchen. "I'm going to change his shirt." Later, when Veronica had left for one of her shopping afternoons, Sophia found Leo in his room, trying to assemble a puzzle on the floor. The short-sleeved shirt Veronica had put on him was slightly askew. As she knelt to straighten it, Sophia noticed something on the boy's arm, on the pale, soft skin just below his shoulder. It wasn't a smudge. It was a bruise, faint, yellowish at the edges, but unmistakably purple in the center. And the shape was what made her blood run cold. They were the subtle, almost ghostly marks of fingers that had squeezed far too hard. The image of that purple mark on Leo's skin was seared into Sophia's mind, an indelible photograph she couldn't erase. It was silent proof, a mute accusation that kept her from sleeping. At night, in her small room at the back of the property, she tossed and turned, Veronica's face superimposing itself over the boy's. The mistress's radiant smile would morph into a sneer of contempt. The hand that stroked Leo's hair was the same one that gripped him with excessive force. Sophia felt trapped in a web of silk and steel. Report Veronica. The idea was absurd. She was the housekeeper, a shadow on the wall. Who would believe her against the word of Mrs. Sterling, the devoted wife of one of the wealthiest men in the country? Arthur, with his aura of power and his obvious adoration for his wife, would fire her on the spot, perhaps even accuse her of something to ensure her silence. He lived in a world where problems were solved with financial investments and the hiring of specialists, a world of tangible goods and assets. How could she explain something as ethereal and poisonous as cruelty disguised as care? No, she couldn't speak up, but she couldn't stay silent either. cowardice would be a stain on her soul, far deeper than the one she'd seen on Leo's arm. She needed something more, something concrete, something that not even Arthur Sterling's fortune could deny. Her observation became an investigation. Every gesture, every word, every silence was analyzed. She noticed that Veronica never left Leo alone with her for long. If Sophia was cleaning the boy's room, Veronica would find an excuse to take him somewhere else. The house, once just a workplace, became a minefield of secrets. Sophia began to pay special attention to Leo's possessions. Among them was a small grey device she sometimes saw on his nightstand. It was a voice recorder. Once, she overheard Arthur explain to a visitor that Leo liked to record the sounds of nature when Laura used to take him to the park. The chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves. It was a relic from a happier time, a connection to the mother he barely knew. Sophia filed the information away, not giving it much thought at the time. The opportunity she both dreaded and hoped for arrived the following Tuesday. It was her day to do the deep cleaning of the sensory therapy room. Veronica had gone out for a charity luncheon, leaving Leo watching a cartoon in the living room, monitored by a baby cam. "I won't be long," Veronica had said, "and Sophia, do a thorough job in that room. The equipment is sensitive." Sophia's heart pounded as she turned the doorknob. The room was cold, impersonal. The walls were padded in a neutral grey. There was a colourful ball pit in one corner, a suspended swing in the centre, and shelves with various objects of different textures. It all looked incredibly expensive and terribly sad. It was a room that simulated joy, but contained none. Sophia began to clean, her methodical movements a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. She vacuumed the floor, dusted the equipment, feeling a growing revulsion for the sterile environment. As she went to vacuum under the large activity mat in the center of the room, she noticed one of the corners was slightly folded, in a way that broke the room's perfect symmetry. It was a tiny, almost insignificant detail, but it screamed at her. With her breath caught in her throat, she knelt and lifted the edge of the mat. There, in the dusty recess under the mat, was the small grey voice recorder. Sophia recognized it immediately. It was the same device she had seen on Leo's nightstand, the relic of his walks with his mother. Her heart began to pound erratically, a muffled drum in the silence of the room. Why would it be here, hidden like this? A child might forget a toy anywhere, but to actively hide it under a heavy mat suggested intent. It suggested fear. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Taking the device was a violation, a breach of trust that could cost her the job, her only source of income. Arthur Sterling was a powerful man with a financial empire that spanned continents. His business involved managing multi-million-dollar funds and speculating in cryptocurrency, a world of power and influence that could crush her like a bug. Veronica, with her beauty and charm, had his ear and his heart. Sophia's word against hers would be a whisper against a storm. But the image of the bruise on Leo's arm returned with painful clarity. The memory of the muffled sob she'd heard through the door. That wasn't her imagination. That was real. And maybe, in this small object in her hand, was the truth. The only weapon she would have against wealth and manipulation. The true asset of this house wasn't in its vaults or stock portfolio. It was in the safety of this silent child, and that asset was under attack. With trembling fingers, she picked up the recorder. It was light, almost insignificant in her palm, but it felt like it weighed a ton. She glanced at the door, her ear tuned to any sound, the engine of a car, the click of a lock. Nothing. The house was submerged in an oppressive quiet. She huddled on the floor, using her own body to muffle any sound the device might make. Her eyes fixed on the small triangular button, the universal symbol for play. She hesitated for an instant that felt like an eternity. What did she expect to find? The confirmation of her fears was almost as terrifying as the uncertainty. Maybe it was just the nature sounds Arthur had mentioned. Maybe it was Leo's own babbling, his attempts to communicate with the world. Pressing that button was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes and pressed the button. The first sound was a low hiss, the white noise of recorded silence. Then, the sound of something being dragged, likely the recorder itself. She heard Leo's soft breathing, a fragile, vulnerable sound. For a moment, she felt immense relief. This was all it was. An innocent recording. She was about to turn it off, to place the device back in its hiding spot and forget everything, when the other voice emerged. It wasn't the sweet, melodic voice Veronica used in front of Arthur. This was a razor, cold, sharp, and filled with a contempt that made the air in Sophia's lungs freeze. "You are going to learn to obey me, you useless little thing. Your father may love you, but I will make sure he sees what a burden you are." Veronica's hissing words dug into Sophia's brain like shards of glass. Useless. Burden. The venom in those two words was more shocking than any shout. Sophia felt a wave of nausea. The cold, sterile air of the therapy room suddenly feeling suffocating. She hit the stop button, the click sounding like a gunshot in the silence. For a long moment, she just knelt there on the floor, the recorder in her hand, the irrefutable proof of a cruelty that was both invisible and omnipresent in this house. Horror gave way to an icy fear. What would she do now? Give the recording to Arthur? The image of the millionaire looking at Veronica with blind adoration flashed in her mind. He would see it as a setup, an attempt by a jealous employee to destroy his new marriage. Arthur Sterling was a master in his own universe, a billionaire who understood interest rates, treasury bonds, inheritance, how to turn capital into more capital. He could analyze balance sheets and predict market fluctuations, but he was emotionally illiterate, unable to read the liabilities accumulating in his own home. To him, Veronica was his best recent investment, an asset of beauty and care that appreciated his family's portfolio. Sophia would be dismissed without a second thought. With hands she could barely control, she placed the recorder back exactly where she found it, under the edge of the mat, smoothing the fiber to erase any trace of her discovery. She stood and finished her work mechanically, her mind a whirlwind. Every surface she cleaned seemed to mock her, reflecting the family's charade. Returning to the kitchen, she found Veronica had already come back from her lunch. She was smiling, showing Sophia a new pair of designer shoes. "Aren't they lovely? A little splurge," she said, her voice once again melodious. Sophia just nodded, feeling the bitter taste of bile in her throat. The woman before her was a masterful actress, switching roles with terrifying ease. That night, in her room, Sophia couldn't eat. The food tasted like ash in her mouth. She sat on the edge of her bed, her body aching with tension. She couldn't give up, not for herself, but for Leo. That boy, trapped in his silence, had no one. His father loved him, yes, but in a distant way, the way one loves an idea, not the complex and fragile reality of a child. It was then that a face surfaced in her memory, a gust of fresh air amid the musty despair. Clara, her childhood friend. They had grown up together in the same working-class neighborhood, sharing dreams and hardships. While Sophia found her path in the dignity of manual labor, Clara, with an iron will, fought her way through law school. She didn't join a large firm to manage the affairs of rich men. Instead, she opened a small office downtown, dedicating her life to defending those without a voice. Children. Clara would understand. Clara wouldn't be intimidated by the Sterlings' fortune or power. She saw the truth behind appearances, a decision formed in Sophia's heart, solid and unshakable. She couldn't fight this battle from inside the fortress. She needed outside help. She needed Clara. But to do that, she would have to leave the house without arousing suspicion and take the only proof she had with her. She stood up, her body still trembling, but her eyes firm. Her next step would require a courage she didn't know she possessed. She would have to lie. She would have to deceive the very people who had hired her. She picked up the old phone she kept on her nightstand. She dialed the number for the main house kitchen. Veronica answered on the second ring. Sophia took a deep breath, preparing her voice to sound fragile and worried. "Mrs. Sterling," she began, "I'm sorry to call so late, but I've just received some news. A very serious family emergency. I need to go home tomorrow. I don't know if I'll be able to come back." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Sophia held her breath. Veronica's voice, when it came, was coated in a thin layer of irritation, poorly disguised as sympathy. A family emergency. "Oh, what a shame, Sophia. Of course. Family first. I hope it's nothing too serious." The dismissal was too quick, the concern too hollow. Veronica asked no further questions, her only interest being the inconvenience Sophia's absence would cause. To her, the housekeeper was just another one of the many assets in her luxurious life, easily replaceable. "Come back when you can," she said, and hung up. Sophia spent a sleepless night sitting in the darkness of her room, her mind racing. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She was about to challenge a man whose fortune was legendary, a billionaire whose dealings influenced the stock market. He owned buildings, investment funds, a personal treasury that could buy the silence and loyalty of anyone. And her, she had nothing but a voice recorder hidden under a rug. And the truth, it was a minuscule David against a Goliath of gold and power. But whenever fear threatened to paralyze her, Veronica's cruel voice echoed in her mind, followed by the image of Leo's empty gaze. That was her fuel, the force that propelled her forward. Before dawn, she rose. She dressed in her usual simple clothes, but instead of her cleaning supplies, she grabbed the worn handbag where she kept her few belongings. The hardest part would be retrieving the evidence. The house was silent, asleep in its own wealth. With her heart pounding in her throat, Sophia went up the stairs, each step a calculated risk. She slipped down the hallway and opened the door to the therapy room. The room's cold air enveloped her. She knelt, lifted the corner of the mat, and there it was. The small grey device. She grabbed it, the cold plastic against her sweaty skin, and shoved it deep into her bag, under an old sweater. Mission accomplished. She just had to get out. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, ready to slip out the back door, a voice stopped her. "Sophia!" It was Arthur. He was standing in the doorway of his office, already dressed in an impeccable suit, but with a weary look in his eyes. "I thought Veronica said you had already left." Sophia's blood ran cold. "Mr. Sterling, good morning. I was just on my way out." He walked closer, and for the first time, he truly looked at her, not as a piece of furniture, but as a person. "Veronica told me about your family emergency. I'm very sorry. Please, if you need anything, an advance, money for travel, don't hesitate to ask. All these assets are worthless if they can't help the people who are loyal to us." His unexpected kindness nearly undid her. It was so much easier to fight a monster than a good blind man. "You're very kind, sir, but it's not necessary. I'll be fine," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She turned toward the door, her hand on the knob, desperate to escape, and then it happened. At the top of the stairs, Leo appeared. He was in his pajamas, his blonde hair tousled, his eyes, usually lost in their own universe, focused on her. He looked at Sophia, at the bag in her hand, at the door, and then a sound came from his mouth, a sound that broke 2 years of silence. So, it wasn't a whole word, just a fragment, a painful effort to form her name. He took a step forward, his small hand reaching out toward her in a mute appeal. In that exact moment, Veronica emerged from the bedroom, her smile freezing on her face as she took in the scene. "Leo, sweetie," she said, her voice artificially cheerful as she pulled him back from the railing. "Don't bother Sophia. She has to go. Arthur stood paralyzed, looking from his son's outstretched hand to his wife's hand containing him. For the first time, the perfect equation of his family life showed an error. He saw one woman his son was desperately trying to connect with, and another who, with a smile, severed that connection. A tiny crack appeared in the wall of his denial, thin as a hair, but there, undeniable. Sophia closed the door of the Sterling mansion behind her, and the click of the lock seemed to seal a chapter of her life. The morning air, crisp and cool, filled her lungs, clearing them of the rarefied, oppressive atmosphere of that house. With the bag heavy on her shoulder, not from the weight of the recorder, but from the weight of its contents, she walked down the tree-lined street toward the bus stop, feeling like a fugitive. Every passing car was in her imagination, Arthur Sterling coming after her, demanding an explanation. The distance between that neighborhood of high walls and her own was measured not in miles, but in universes. On the crowded bus, squeezed between a construction worker and a college student, she clutched the bag to her chest. That small plastic object contained a truth so toxic it could implode all their lives. The risk she was taking was immense. Losing her job was the least of her worries. She could be sued, accused of slander, by a man who had an army of lawyers on his payroll, a man whose net worth was greater than the GDP of some small countries. But then, the image of Leo's small, outstretched arm, the hesitant sound of her name on his lips, overrode everything. For the first time in 2 years, he had tried to cross the bridge of his silence, and it had been for her. That realization gave her the strength she needed. Meanwhile, in the mansion, Arthur was trying to focus. Seated in his office, his computer screen displayed complex stock market charts, the performance of his shares, the profitability of his investment funds. These were images that normally captivated him, the game of numbers and strategy that had built his fortune. But today, the numbers seemed meaningless. The green lines of profit and the red lines of loss carried no weight. The only image in his mind was of his son at the top of the stairs, Leo, trying to speak, trying to reach for Sophia. Why Sophia? A woman they barely knew, who had only been there for a few weeks. Veronica entered the office, carrying a cup of coffee and a practiced smile. "Is everything all right, darling? You seem so distant." She sat in the leather armchair across from him, the picture of elegance. "I was just thinking about that scene this morning. Poor Leo. He gets so attached to routines, doesn't he?" Sophia's presence had already become part of his day. "I'll call the agency today and have them find a replacement, maybe someone with more experience." Her words were logical, reasonable, but for the first time, Arthur felt a chill. He remembered Laura, how she would celebrate every small step of Leo's progress with a genuine, explosive joy. Veronica analyzed the boy's behavior with the coldness of an asset manager evaluating an underperforming investment. She didn't see the child. She saw the problem. Clara's office was nothing like the environment Sophia had grown used to. It was a small room on the second floor of an old building downtown. The walls were lined with overflowing bookshelves and case files. The air smelled of paper, coffee, and relentless determination. Clara, her curly hair held up by a pencil and her eyes seeing through any facade, gave her a fierce hug. "Sophia, what happened? Your voice on the phone. You had me worried." Sitting in the chair across from her friend's desk, Sophia felt the tension of the past weeks begin to give way, and tears threatened to spill. She took a deep breath, opened her worn handbag, and pulled out the small grey recorder. She placed it on the desk, between a stack of papers and a chipped mug. The object looked small and harmless, a strange piece of technology in the analog room. "Clara," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I need you to listen to something. Something that happens in that house when the blind multi-millionaire goes to work." Clara looked at the recorder for a moment, then raised her eyes to her friend. She had known Sophia her whole life and could read the nuances in her face. She saw exhaustion, fear, but above all, a steely resolve. Without a word, she reached out, took the device, and pressed play. The initial hiss filled the small office, followed by Leo's soft breathing. Sophia watched Clara's face as Veronica's words, cold and cruel, cut through the air. "You are going to learn to obey me, you useless little thing. Your father may love you, but I will make sure he sees what a burden you are." Clara's jaw tightened. Her eyes, once filled with concern for her friend, now burned with a cold, controlled fury. She hit the stop button, the ensuing silence feeling heavier than the words themselves. She played it again, and then a third time, as if to be certain the venom was real. "My God, Sophia," she whispered, placing the recorder on the desk with a reverent care, as if it were a sacred piece of evidence. "This is monstrous!" Sophia then told her everything. Veronica's shift in behavior, the untouched food, the muffled crying behind the door, the bruise on Leo's arm, and finally, the moment on the stairs, the boy's attempt to speak, to reach for her. Clara listened intently, scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad, her pencil moving with a fierce urgency. "She's smart," Clara said, tapping the end of the pencil on the desk. "Emotional abuse. It's the hardest to prove. It doesn't leave the same scars as physical abuse, and the boy doesn't talk. She uses that. In front of the father, she's the perfect stepmother. Alone with the boy, she psychologically destroys him. And Arthur Sterling," Clara sighed, looking out the dusty window. "Men like him who build fortunes from nothing are brilliant with the logic of business, of cash flow, of managing liabilities, but they're easy prey for emotional manipulation. He isn't seeing the depreciation of his most precious asset." "What can we do?" Sophia asked, her voice thick with hope. "Can we take this to the police? To Child Protective Services?" Clara shook her head. "Not yet. This is powerful," she said, gesturing to the recorder, "but her word against yours, with the lawyers his money can buy. They'll discredit you. They'll say you planted the recording, that you have a grudge. We need something undeniable. We need him to see. We need him to hear it with his own ears as it's happening." An idea began to form in Clara's mind, daring and risky. "Sophia, you have to go back." Sophia's heart plummeted. "Go back? Clara, I can't. Now that she knows I had to leave, she'll be suspicious. It will be worse for Leo." "No," Clara said, leaning forward across the desk, her eyes locked on Sophia's. "You'll go back, but with a story. Your family emergency resolved itself faster than expected. You're going to call her, be humble, say you desperately need the job. She'll take you back. You know why? Because it's easier to control someone she already knows than to train someone new. And because her ego won't allow her to believe that a simple housekeeper could possibly be a threat." The plan was terrifying. To walk back into the lion's den, knowing exactly where the claws were. "And then?" Sophia asked, her breath short. "And then," Clara continued, her voice low and strategic, "we set a trap that not all of Arthur Sterling's capital and assets can disarm." Returning to the Sterling mansion was one of the hardest things Sophia had ever done. Every step toward the Grand Iron Gate felt like it weighed a ton. The story Clara had coached her to tell rolled off her tongue convincingly, rehearsed for hours. She called Veronica, her voice laced with a false humility and desperation, explaining that the issue with her sick aunt had miraculously resolved itself and she desperately needed her job back. As Clara had predicted, Veronica barely hid the satisfaction in her voice. "Why, Sophia, that's wonderful. I'm so glad your aunt is better," she said, with a condescension that was almost palpable through the phone. "Yes, of course you can come back. I hadn't called the agency yet. Be here tomorrow. Usual time." The ease with which she was accepted back was an ill omen. Veronica didn't see her as a threat. She saw her as an object, a piece of furniture that had been out of place and was now returning. The next day, re-entering the house, the environment seemed the same, but everything felt different to Sophia. The beauty of the furniture, the sparkle of the crystals, the scent of beeswax. It all seemed like a thin veneer over something rotten. When her eyes met Leo's, who was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, her heart clenched. He watched her silently, not reaching out this time, but there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, a spark of connection that Sophia clung to like a lifeline. Veronica greeted her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome back, Sophia. There's much to be done." The days that followed were an exercise in steel nerves. Sophia cleaned, polished, and scrubbed. Ever aware that she was being watched, Veronica always seemed to be nearby, monitoring her movements, a constant, oppressive presence. The door to the therapy room continued to close, but Sophia no longer heard the muffled sounds. The silence was now absolute, which was somehow even more frightening. She found the recorder again, in the same spot, and new recordings had been made. But now, Veronica was more careful. Her words were more subtle, her tone more controlled. She spoke of how Leo's father would be disappointed if he didn't make progress, how the investment in his therapies was high and needed profitability. She was using the language of Arthur's world to wound his son, a form of abuse even more insidious and calculated. Sophia took the new recordings to Clara each night, and together they refined the plan. The lawyer was building a case, piece by piece. The trap had to be perfect. Meanwhile, the small crack in Arthur's denial had begun to widen. The echo of his son's near word, the appeal in his eyes, gnawed at him. He started watching his wife differently. He noticed the tension in her shoulders when Leo refused to eat. He saw the fleeting impatience in her eyes when the boy didn't respond to a question. They were minuscule details, micro-expressions he had previously ignored, blinded by her beauty and the promise of happiness. One afternoon, he came home early to a strangely quiet house. He went upstairs and found Veronica coming out of the therapy room, gently closing the door behind her. "Darling, what a surprise," she said, visibly startled. "How was the meeting about the dividends from that tech company?" "It went well," he replied, his eyes fixed on the closed door. "Where's Leo?" "Oh, he's resting. Today's session was very intense. He needs some quiet time to process." Arthur felt a strange impulse. "I want to see him." Veronica's smile faltered for a split second. "Of course, my love, but it's best we don't disturb him right now. The therapist said the quiet is crucial for him." She took his arm, trying to lead him toward their bedroom, but Arthur didn't move. He looked at the doorknob, a straight line of cold metal, and felt an overwhelming urge to turn it, to break the rule his wife had imposed. Something in his gut, the same instinct that made him a billionaire in the cutthroat world of business, told him there was a liability accumulating behind that door, an emotional debt that would soon come due. Arthur couldn't get the image of the closed door out of his mind. That simple barrier of white-painted wood became a symbol of everything he didn't know about his own home. In his office, he stared at the performance charts of his investments, at the numbers representing his vast fortune, and felt a profound emptiness. He was a master at calculating business risks, at analyzing a company's profit potential, at deciding the right time to buy or sell stocks. He knew how to diversify his capital, protect his net worth, and secure passive income through interest and dividends. But he had failed at the most fundamental investment of all, his son's happiness. The inheritance he was building for Leo wasn't just money and assets. It was also a legacy of silence and loneliness. The memory of Laura assaulted him with painful frequency. He remembered how she understood Leo without words. When the boy had a meltdown, overwhelmed by the world, Laura didn't isolate him in a sterile room. She would hold him, wrap him in a heavy blanket, and sing softly until the storm in his mind passed. Her love was a safe harbor, not a therapy program. Veronica's love, he was beginning to realize, was conditional, based on performance. It was an investment that demanded a return. That evening, he watched Veronica at dinner. She talked about an art auction, about the importance of acquiring certain pieces to appreciate the family's assets. She was flawless, intelligent, a perfect partner for a man of his standing. But when she looked at Leo, who was pushing a piece of broccoli around his plate, her eyes turned cold, calculating. There was no warmth, no unconditional acceptance that a child needs to flourish. Arthur felt an overwhelming guilt, a character flaw that no successful stock trade could offset. He had been blind, not by grief, but by convenience. Veronica was easy. She managed the house, the therapists, the problem of Leo, leaving him free to focus on what he did best, accumulating wealth. The next day, he saw Sophia dusting the bookshelves in his office. She moved with her usual quiet efficiency, but he noticed the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her frame. She seemed to be carrying a burden too heavy for her small shoulders. On an impulse, he closed his laptop. Sophia, he said, his voice softer than usual. She turned, surprised. Yes, sir. He hesitated, the words stuck in his throat. How could he ask? How could he admit his own monumental failure to an employee? You spend more time with Leo during the day than I do. Do you think he's happy? The question hung in the air, shattering all barriers of formality between them. Sophia looked directly at him, and in her eyes he saw no fear or evasion. He saw a deep sadness and an overwhelming compassion. She didn't need to break her confidence or reveal her secret. Her expression was the answer. She simply said, her voice firm but gentle, "Mr. Sterling, a father always knows the answer to that question, deep in his heart." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew, deep in his heart, he knew the answer, but he had refused to listen to it. In that moment, the decision was made. He picked up his phone. Across town, Sophia's phone vibrated silently in her pocket. It was a text from Clara, just 3 words. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Arthur sent a text to his personal assistant. Helena, cancel all my meetings tomorrow afternoon. Unavoidable family matter. He looked at Sophia, a silent understanding passing between them. The trap was set. The day of the trap dawned with an oppressive grey sky, a perfect reflection of Arthur's state of mind. He spent the morning in his office, feigning work. He opened cash flow spreadsheets, reviewed the profitability of his latest investments, and even took a video call about acquiring a promising new block of shares. But his mind wasn't there. It was upstairs, in the tense quiet of the house, counting the hours, the minutes, the seconds. At noon, he had lunch with Veronica. Her conversation was light, superficial, about plans for their summer vacation, the exchange rate of the euro, a new decorator she wanted to hire. Arthur answered in monosyllables, the food tasting like cardboard in his mouth. He looked at her across the table and felt like a traitor, but he no longer knew who he was betraying. Her, for planning this charade, or himself, for having lived in it for so long. At 2:45, he stood, adjusted his suit, and kissed her cheek. I have a meeting out of the office. I shouldn't be long, he lied, his heart hammering against his ribs. The drive back to his own house 15 minutes later was the longest journey of his life. He drove under the speed limit, his hands sweating on the leather steering wheel. A part of him, a cowardly, desperate part, wanted to keep driving, to pass the entrance to his gated community and just disappear. But the image of Leo, his son, his only son, kept him on course. He was no longer the multi-millionaire Arthur Sterling, the business shark. He was just a father, terrified of what he might find in his own home. Following Clara's instructions, he parked 2 blocks away and walked, letting himself in through the small service gate that was always unlocked. The house, seen from the back, looked like a sleeping fortress. The silence was the first thing that hit him. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a tranquil afternoon, but the silence of a held breath, of something about to break. He entered through the kitchen door. Sophia was not there, which was part of the plan. She was supposed to be upstairs, cleaning the hallway, a silent witness. With the care of a thief, Arthur went up the back stairs, his expensive shoes making no sound on the plush runner. Each step was an accusation, a step toward a verdict he had delayed for far too long. Reaching the upstairs hallway, he saw it. The door to the therapy room was closed. Sophia was further down the hall, her back to him, polishing a mirror with slow, deliberate strokes. Her presence an anchor of normalcy in a sea of tension. Arthur approached the door, his heartbeat so loud in his ears he feared everyone could hear it. He pressed his ear to the cool wood, his breath caught in his chest. And then he heard it, her voice. But it wasn't Veronica's voice, the melody that enchanted him. It was the sound of a porcelain mask shattering, revealing the cold steel beneath. "You will not eat until you learn to look me in the eyes when I speak to you." The words weren't shouted. They were delivered in a low, controlled tone that made them all the more terrifying. They were words that sought not to educate, but to break. In that moment, all of Arthur's denial, all of his willful blindness disintegrated. The love he felt for her turned to ash, with a hand that trembled, not from fear, but from a pure, cold fury he had never known. He turned the knob. He threw the door open. Time seemed to freeze. The scene before him was seared into his mind with the clarity of a lightning strike. His son, Leo, was huddled on the floor, his face pale, his plate of food untouched before him. Veronica was standing over him, her posture rigid, her face a mask of contained rage, and between them, like a shield, was Sophia. She was kneeling beside Leo, her body positioned to protect him, her eyes fixed on Veronica, not with fear, but with a quiet, unshakable defiance. In that instant, the blindfold over Arthur's eyes didn't just fall. It was ripped away with a violence that left him blinded by the truth. The silence that followed the opening of the door was louder than any scream. For a second that stretched into an eternity, the three adults remained frozen in their positions. The victim, the abuser, and the protector. Arthur felt the floor drop out from under him. The white-hot rage burned away the fog of his denial, but what followed was a pain so profound, a guilt so crushing, that it left him breathless. He didn't just see Veronica's cruelty, he saw the reflection of his own colossal failure. He had purchased this cruelty, installed it in the heart of his home, paying for it with the currency of his loneliness and blind hope. Veronica was the first to move. The mask of rage dissolved, replaced by a pale shock, which quickly gave way to a desperate attempt to reconstruct the facade. A trembling, sickly smile appeared on her lips. "Arthur, darling, thank God you're here. It's not what it looks like. I was just applying one of the firmness techniques Dr. Evans recommended. Leo was being so stubborn, and this woman..." She shot a venomous glare at Sophia. "She interrupted me, frightening the boy." Her words were like the buzzing of an insect to Arthur. He barely registered them. His gaze passed through her as if she were glass, focusing on his son, huddled and terrified. He looked at Sophia, who hadn't moved, her body still a shield, her face a canvas of calm resolve. She didn't have to say a word. Her courage spoke for itself. "Get out," Arthur said. The words left his mouth, low and devoid of all emotion. It was the voice he used to fire executives, to liquidate a failed business, to cut his losses. It was final. Veronica blinked, her smile faltering. "What? Darling, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." He cut her off, his voice still in that same deathly calm tone. "I understand that my entire net worth, my entire fortune, wasn't enough to buy you an ounce of human decency. I understand that the biggest liability in my life wasn't on my balance sheets, but sleeping next to me. Get your things. I want you out of this house in 1 hour." Desperation flooded her face. "Arthur, please, it's her. This housekeeper has been putting things in your head." "The only thing she has put," Arthur said, taking a step into the room, "is herself between my son and the monster I invited in. Now, get out." Veronica looked at him, searching for the slightest crack in his resolve, the faintest trace of the blind man she had manipulated for so long. She found nothing. What she saw was a stranger, a man whose gaze assessed her not with love, but with the cold contempt of a judge. Defeated, she turned and left the room, the arrogance of her posture finally broken. Arthur heard her footsteps hurrying down the hall, the sound of their master bedroom door slamming shut. The main conflict was over, but Arthur's internal war was just beginning. He turned to the scene that remained. Sophia slowly rose to her feet, giving him space, then retreated to a corner of the room, allowing them privacy. Arthur looked at Leo, his small boy on the floor, and the dam of his guilt broke. His knees buckling, he knelt, not as the billionaire Arthur Sterling, but as a broken father. He said nothing. He just knelt there, a few feet away, making himself small, vulnerable. Slowly, like a frightened animal emerging from its hiding place, Leo lifted his eyes from the floor and looked at his father. And for the first time in a very long time, there wasn't a universe of distance between them. There was only a shared pain and the fragile beginning of a way back home. The months following Veronica's departure were like the slow, painful healing of a deep wound. The legal proceedings, solidified by the recording and Sophia's testimony, ran their course, but Arthur distanced himself from all of it. His attention, once divided between the stock market and the charade of his happiness, now had a single, absolute focus: Leo, the immense fortune he had amassed, the dollars in offshore accounts, the portfolio of assets. It all seemed suddenly irrelevant, a pile of colored paper in the face of the monumental task of rebuilding his son's soul. He learned Leo's silent language. He learned that a finger tracing the outline of a leaf was a poem, that the perfect alignment of toy cars was a way of bringing order to inner chaos, that an averted gaze was not rejection, but protection. Arthur sold a significant block of shares in a tech company, not for a new investment, but to free himself from constant meetings, clearing his afternoons. He dismissed the therapists Veronica had hired, whose methods seemed more focused on forcing a version of normal than on understanding the child. The house, once a stage for perfection, became a sanctuary, and at the center of this sanctuary was Sophia. She was no longer the housekeeper. At Arthur's insistence, she put down the cleaning cloths and picked up the storybooks. She became a teacher, a therapist, a friend. It was she who rediscovered Leo's love for the sounds of nature, taking him into the garden not for structured sessions, but to feel the grass on his feet and hear the wind in the trees. It was she who taught Arthur that the greatest return he could ever get came not from dividends, but from the fleeting glimmer of interest in his son's eyes. Arthur's gratitude for Sophia was an ocean, vast and deep, but over time, admiration for her strength and tenderness for her kindness blossomed into something more. He found himself watching her, the way she smiled at Leo, the infinite patience in her gestures, the quiet wisdom in her gaze. He realized that true wealth wasn't measured by his net worth, but by the courage and integrity of a woman who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. One spring evening, after Leo had fallen asleep, Arthur found her on the terrace, looking out at the starlit garden. "Sophia," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "I've spent my life building an empire, a treasury of tangible things. But you taught me what true value is. You cleaned the darkness from this house and from my soul." She turned to him, her dark eyes shining in the soft moonlight. He moved closer, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. "I don't want you to be an employee," he continued. "I can't pay you for what you've done, because what you've given us is priceless. I want to ask you to stay, Sophia, not as a governess, but as the co-founder of our new family, a family built on truth." The tears that welled in her eyes were not of sadness, but of a joy she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't need words. A simple nod of her head sealed the pact. In that moment, Leo, who had woken up and come silently to the door, took a step outside. He looked up at the sky, then at Arthur, and then at Sophia, and then, with a clarity that made both adults' hearts stop, he pointed to the moon and said a single, perfect word, "Beautiful." Arthur reached out his hand, not to his son, but to Sophia. She took it,